Hello, my name is Rachel Mantlik, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the correlation of autism in children and childhood obesity. So, to begin, the reason why I chose this topic was because I actually have a close friend whose sister is diagnosed with autism, and I was really interested because she lives in a special home facility, and basically she gets care from from the nurses, etc. So she lives there with other people who have been diagnosed with autism, and she's overweight, and many of the peers that she takes pictures with is also overweight. So it kind of sparked this interest, and I wanted to see if there was a correlation. So to begin, I'm just going to give you a little background and explain what exactly autism is. So autism spectrum disorder is a neurological disorder, and it's often diagnosed within the ages of 0 to 3 years old. So basically infancy to right basically in infancy. And so the common symptoms for this is that there are usually some sort of communication difficulty, and so the parent begins to wonder, okay, what is wrong with my child, which leads them to take their child to the doctor and then become diagnosed with autism. Now, this disorder is very specific and different in the sense that no child with autism is the same. So two children that have been diagnosed with autism may have completely different symptoms, and so because of that, it's considered a heterogeneous condition because they have different profiles. However, they usually will lose some sort of loss or lose their motor function, so whether to be able to feed themselves, brush their hair, just like common day-to-day things, and then eventually it will progress depending on the severity of autism. But they usually will also have some sort of social difficulty, so interacting with peers or professionals, parents, etc. Anyone really they come in contact with, they usually have some sort of difficulty with that. And then it is a genetic disorder, so it's a chromosomal disorder. It comes from the mom. There still needs to be a lot more research to learn more about this specific disorder, but it's very common. It affects 1 in every 68 children, and so that is definitely a very high percentage of people, and so that's why a lot more research needs to be done to figure out what causes it and potential cures for this disease, but it's still way out in the future before a cure for this disease happens. Okay, so why should we analyze autism spectrum disorder, and do children with autism have an increased risk of obesity? So why does the health professionals care? Why should any person in the nutritional field care about this topic? Well, to begin, obesity overall is becoming an increasing epidemic across the world. So the fact that this specific population would be even more at risk for becoming obese is a problem, because as many of us know, with obesity comes a plethora of other health-related issues such as heart disease, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, metabolic syndrome, and also psychological disorders that kind of are symptoms of this or are effects of this disease that many people don't talk about, but it could lead to bullying, etc. And so it's actually the fact of the matter is that 31.8% of children within the ages of 2 years old to 18 are actually overweight, and 16.9% are obese, and those are pretty astounding numbers. Those are massive numbers, and they're constantly growing, and so it just kind of made me interested to figure out if children with autism are at an even higher risk. Excuse me. So the first research article that I looked into was a cross-sectional study, and the participants in the study were ages 2 through 19, and they were only allowed to participate in this study if they had been diagnosed with autism. And so overall, there was 5,023 children that participated in this study, and it considered patients' ethnicity, age, gender, height, weight, And from that information, the weight and height, they use that to calculate BMI. But it should be noted that the information reported to this from this study, like the height and weight was self-reported, and so with that comes a bit of error, and so that is definitely one of the limitations of the study. However, they used a statistical analysis to determine if these children were obese, overweight, or within the normal range, and they compared it to a normal developing child, which is a child who does not have a disorder or autism. And they used a z-test to determine this when they graphed, and what they found was that 33.6% of the children met the criteria for being overweight, which is the 85th percentile for the BMI, and 18% were overweight, or excuse me, obese. And so that is, those results were conclusive to support the hypothesis that children that are obese, or excuse me, children that do have autism have a higher chance of being obese. And what they found also was that the more severe the symptoms of the child that had autism, the higher the chance of that child becoming obese or overweight. Now, the next article that I researched was essentially similar to this. However, they considered screen time, so the amount of time that a child is in front of anything like a TV, a computer, any sort of gaming system, and they took that into account when looking at the study. So the next thing that they did, which was different than the other study, was they broke it down by gender, so boys and girls. Something to note from this study was that it's not done in the United States, it was done in Ireland, and as a whole, in Ireland they have a lower percentage of people who are overweight and obese that are children, and so that was something to consider also for this study, definitely a limitation. However, the study of design was a cross-sectional. There were 114 participants. And actually, in this study, they compared typically developing, normally developing, as I mentioned earlier, and autism. So they compared the two, and then within that same age range, 2 to 18, or 2 to 17, excuse me. And they filled out a questionnaire asking them how many times they exercised in a week, and they asked for the time. So if it was over 20 minutes, they would check a box, under 20 minutes, check a box, etc. And so what they found was that with children that had autism, there's a less likely probability that they would engage in physical activity during their free time. And oftentimes what they found was because there was that social interaction that they didn't know how to interact with people of their own age, so their peers, and so they were not likely to do it. And so as a result, they were thinking that that is what was contributing to the increases in overweight and obese children with autism spectrum disorder. So again, this study supported the hypothesis that children with autism spectrum disorder have a higher chance of developing a comorbidity and then eventually leading to obesity or being overweight. And finally, the third article that I used, or that I was studying, basically did analyze the exact same thing. Children that were normally developing versus children that had autism. And this was a very large sample size, so there were 85,000 participants in this study, which is definitely substantially more than the other one. So you have less variation and less error. So the results are overall more consistent, and they, again, the height and weight were self-reported, which is a limitation of this study. But again, it reported the same reports. So 30.4% of the participants that had autism were obese, whereas 23.6% of the normally developing children were obese. So there's 7% difference, and that 7% shows that there's definitely a difference between children with autism and children that are normally developing. So now the limitations of this research is that a lot of it, as I mentioned before, is self-reporting data. So there's no consistent way to report the heights and weights of the participants in the study. And so that can definitely lead to variation in the study, because some people may be over-reporting the height, some people may be under-reporting the height. And so there's no consistencies throughout that throughout the research, and so that could lead to variation, thus impacting the BMI calculation, since it's height over weight squared. And also, there isn't enough research that has been done on autism spectrum disorder. This is definitely an area where there's more and more research developing, and they are trying to determine what are the causes, basically, of why these children are becoming more overweight than the regular developing children. And so they think that it could also be drugs. Some of the medications that they're being prescribed may lead to weight gain, and also and their sleep schedule, and as mentioned before, their physical activity time and and sleep patterns, and their eating habits as well. So that's definitely something that needs more research as well, but it's slowly starting to become more prominent. So overall, my research has showed that there is conclusive evidence to support the hypothesis that children with autism spectrum disorder have a higher risk of becoming obese in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you learned something about childhood obesity in children with autism spectrum disorder.